Okay, so let's get down to some of the meatier issues. I wanted to start with a little bit of overview, and I know some of you will know all about this, but there's others who might not. But I want to talk about time, place, manner restrictions. Professor Virelli, last fall when the Occupy movement was heating up, many folks contacted us, and spoke to each other and said, wait a second, how can the government pass laws, how can TPD come out and limit our free speech and limit our free expression when all we want to do is hang out at Curtis Hickson Park and take over the park for, forever, for how long? That's just free expression. And the question arose over and over, and they wanted us to come to their aid in terms of, making sure the city would let them sleep in the parks, which is potentially a First Amendment type of thing, but other types of free expression and free speech issues were at risk at the time. Can you explain to all of us how the government can regulate speech, and specifically explain the government's ability to enforce reasonable time, place, manner restrictions, kind of Con Law 101?
Maybe Con Law 1, I'll leave out the 01 in the interest of time. I think it's a relatively simple concept that many of you will know as well as I. It's a balancing act in general. Most all of the rights in the Bill of Rights end up creating some sort of a balancing act. There are no absolutes in any of those first 10 amendments. There are no absolutes in the 14th. I guess the 13th is the closest, but that's for a different panel. The First Amendment protects our right to speech and protects our right to express ourselves. It does not protect that right absolutely independent of other responsibilities or independent of the government's responsibility to keep citizens safe, to protect the health and welfare of the public. And the time, place, and manner restrictions, and that's become a term of art, but that's really what they are. Time, place, and manner restrictions are a way that the Supreme Court has recognized to balance the interest of the public in free speech and expression and the needs of the government. Again, remember, our free speech rights are exercised only against the government. So we have no constitutional free speech rights against private actors. So it really is a balance between individuals' rights to speak and the government's ability or need to restrict that speech in reasonable ways. As I tell my students, con law is about tests as much as it is about answers. And what is the test for a time, place, and manner restriction? The government is allowed to create reasonable restrictions that are narrowly tailored to a significant government interest that leave open ample alternative channels for speech. That is a lot of language. We will talk about it, I'm sure, and deconstruct it over the time we're here. But that is the idea. Reasonable regulations, narrowly tailored or directed at or closely related to an important government interest like health and safety that leave open alternative channels that are not prohibitive of the ultimate right to express one's views in some sort of public way. And I hope that's a good start.
Thank you. Thank you. City Attorney Shimberg, this past week, all the newspapers and the other media sources have been reporting about the so-called clean zone ordinance that the city administration, the mayor, and your office have been working on. And it's 18 pages long. Everybody can look it up online because it's coming to City Council for their this Thursday morning's agenda for first reading. Jim, I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain a little bit, why the city administration and your office feel that it's important to have a clean zone ordinance, and clearly there are restrictions and limitations on free speech. Speak to perhaps the reasonableness of it, as Professor Virelli spoke to a minute ago. And you and I have had many of these conversations over the last couple of months, just generically about these types of issues. So, and then after you get done speaking about it generally, I want you to speak to the 60-minute limitation provision, if you can.
Okay.
Probably want to pull that mic.
Well, we've been working for quite some time on what the appropriate type of ordinance that we should present to City Council for their consideration. And I know we've got several. We've been working on an ordinance to present to City Council for their consideration, and they will start that consideration this week. And there, as we mentioned, there are several members here today, and I'm not in any way intending to speak for them. They talk about what we put together as a draft. We've looked at other jurisdictions that have hosted national conventions. We've talked to attorneys, we've talked with law enforcement. We've been, as you mentioned, there's been a very close group that's been working together. Everybody from the Secret Service to the local law enforcement to transportation, different parts of the city administration, and we're trying to put together an ordinance that would respect First Amendment rights as well as what we consider give us the best ability to have a safe and productive convention. So the draft ordinance has things like permitting, expedited permitting processes, because you've been beating us up for a long time that our current permitting processes take too long. We've got
that's the good part of the ordinance. Okay.
We've got expedited permitting processes. We've extended hours of operation for our city parks. We have we're going to create an official parade route for groups that want to conduct a parade during that time frame of the convention. We've also created what we call the clean zone, which was patterned after what we've done in Super Bowls. As you know, Tampa's had several Super Bowls, and they called it the clean zone. I think that's why we called this ordinance that. But it identifies certain parts of the city that certain items that could be used as weapons or could be used for purposes that may not be peaceful would be prohibited or restricted.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Mickey, you and I have been around the block, as indicated by our white hair, but the 60 minutes, we'll get back to that in a second. Mickey, how do you feel about, have you had a chance to read some of this ordinance over the last day or so? How do you feel about this? They call one area the public viewing area. In other cities, they've called it the free speech zone. Does that jump out at you as problematic at all?
Well, going back to the time, place, and manner restrictions, the key word in that phrase is reasonable. And what somebody thinks from the government is reasonable may differ greatly from what the press or the public thinks is reasonable. The question is, and I know I'm kind of mixing metaphors here, but in another very important case, separate was not necessarily equal. So when you've got people that are allowed to speak what they feel like saying, or allowing the press to cover that, but they're so far away from being effective to actually give voice to those people, I think that in itself could be a problem. Almost all of these things are very fact-specific. I'm sure, no matter how well things go, that there are going to be cases that are going to be argued when people are arrested. And I'm sure each and every one of them will hinge on the specific facts of what happened and what was going on during that time, which is one of the reasons I believe it's so important to be able to document and record those events. Because when you get down to the he said, she said, usually, and I see a lot of this, the criminal complaint or the police report sometimes differs very greatly from the video and the audio of that very same scene. So keeping the press away sometimes serves a purpose, but
just as a follow-up, one of the things that I sent you an email about today, because we just noticed it, is that one of the 3 things that are prohibited in the public viewing area, and maybe even the entire clean zone, include monopods, bipods, and tripods. And I asked the city about that, and they said, well, TPD has concern that these metal poles could be used or have been used elsewhere as weapons. I would think that your organization could have a lot of concern about that, especially with your folks who have big cameras and don't want to be lugging them around in the August heat.
Well, that's true, but I'm sure in that kind of fluid situation, and I shot long enough, it's really nice to have the luxury of being able to shoot on sticks, as these guys in the back can attest to. But when you've got the police moving around and protesters moving around, I think it's going to be very unlikely that most people are going to be using a tripod. I've shot the sidelines for ESPN for 12 years. Nobody gets to have a tripod on the sideline. It's dangerous when the players might run into that. But that being said, I also don't know of any photographers that would think of using a tripod or their camera as a weapon. A weapon of hitting somebody with it. I mean, it's a very powerful weapon, as in, you know, the pen is mightier than the sword, but not to be used as to assault somebody with.
Okay, Jim, I didn't mean to let you off the hook on the 60-minute limitation, and that's been written about in the newspapers. Basically, what that says is that if you're going to hold a protest rally or an assembly, or if you're going to hold a parade and you go through the permit process, that somehow or another the city wants each of the groups to limit themselves to 60 minutes. Well, what's the purpose of that? And Julie, Ellyn, how do you feel about that?
First, let me, caveat again that this is an ordinance that's being presented.
Talk to us, please. Yes.
Look at us.
Just keep it close to the mouth.
The draft ordinance has that in there. That's obviously up for city council consideration. The purpose of that was twofold. One was that some of the police officers during that time frame are going to be wearing heavy equipment and would not be able to stand out in the August heat for very long. The second issue is, I don't know how many of you went to the mayor's State of the City address this morning, but it was early April and it was in the boiling outside, and luckily it didn't last an hour, but I don't know how you'd be able to go much longer. We also want to try to create as many spots as possible for groups to be able to participate either in the parades or in the public gatherings. So that was based on the evidence that we determined. That was what we thought was the appropriate time limit. Obviously, that's up for city council consideration.